Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little offbeat, a little tragic, a little weird, frankly. So dim the lights, settle in, maybe grab some tea you'll probably forget to drink, because tonight we're talking about the last days of the eunuchs. Yes, eunuchs. The men who weren't entirely men anymore. The ones history remembers mostly as palace servants, keepers of harems, advisors to kings, sometimes even kingmakers themselves. For centuries, they were everywhere in the great courts of Asia, the Middle East, Byzantium, even parts of Europe if you squint hard enough. And then empires fell. The Ottomans crumbled. The Chinese emperors vanished into retirement, or more often, early graves. The Byzantines had been gone for centuries already, so no points there. And with them, the entire political ecosystem of the eunuch class dissolved. So what happened to them? Did they just vanish into history like nobody noticed? Did they live out quiet retirements somewhere, maybe forming very awkward social clubs? The answer, like most things in history, is messy, kind of sad, and at times darkly funny. So let's glide back in time, nice and easy, to the fading twilight of empires, and meet some of the last men, sort of, standing. We should probably start in China, because if anyone kept extremely detailed, slightly over-the-top records about palace life, it was the Chinese imperial court. And the eunuchs there weren't just random servants dusting the furniture. By the Ming dynasty, these guys practically ran the place. Some emperors trusted them more than their own families, which, given how many families tried to kill each other for power, was maybe fair. But power does strange things to people. And absolute power, well, it turns out it also does strange things to people who've been forcibly castrated as teenagers. The Ming eunuchs became notorious for corruption, palace coups, and the kind of insane palace drama Netflix would reject as too unrealistic. By the late 1800s, though, the entire system was rotting from the inside. Western powers were busy carving up pieces of China like it was a slightly overcooked roast. The Qing dynasty, the last imperial dynasty, was limping toward its inevitable fall. And the eunuchs? They were stuck in the middle, watching the world that had given them meaning slowly collapse. One of the last famous eunuchs was Sun Yao-ting. He was castrated, voluntarily, believe it or not, in the early 1900s because his family thought it would get him a cushy job in the Forbidden City. You can imagine the sales pitch. Son, we have an opportunity for you. Minor downside, but think of the career benefits. Except by the time he actually recovered from the whole operation, the dynasty had fallen. The last emperor, Puyi, had technically abdicated in 1912, though he was still living in the palace for a while because nobody had figured out what else to do with him. Sun Yao-ting finally made it inside as a servant, just in time to watch the entire institution crumble like a badly made cake. When the imperial family was kicked out for good in 1924, Sun and the other remaining eunuchs were basically laid off. No pension plan, no second career lined up. One day they were palace insiders, the next they were just guys with very complicated medical histories trying to survive in a world that no longer cared. Some ended up as beggars. Others found work as caretakers in temples, or as curiosities in Beijing's winding old streets, living reminders of a vanished empire. Sun Yao-ting himself lived all the way until 1996. Yes, the 1990s, giving interviews to curious journalists who could hardly believe the imperial eunuch system had lasted into living memory. Imagine that. A man castrated for an empire that didn't even exist by the time he healed from the surgery, living long enough to see color television. History moves fast. Let's float over to the Ottoman Empire for a moment, because they had their own eunuch drama going on. If China was the land of overworked palace eunuchs, the Ottomans were the land of terrifyingly powerful ones. The chief black eunuch, yes, that was his official title, was one of the most important people in the empire. He controlled access to the sultan, managed the harem, and occasionally dabbled in a bit of state policy because, why not? You're already running half the palace. But when the Ottoman Empire finally collapsed after World War I, the palace eunuchs found themselves in the same awkward boat as their Chinese counterparts. The sultans were gone, the harems were dissolved, the Republic of Turkey, founded in 1923, was not exactly hiring eunuchs to run parliament. So picture this. The emperors are gone. The palaces are echoing with emptiness. And the eunuchs, those once all-powerful gatekeepers, are now wandering around like employees of a company that suddenly went out of business after 1,000 years of corporate stability. Except there are no severance packages, no retraining programs, just an awkward silence where the center of the world used to be, because when the Qing dynasty fell in 1912, the Forbidden City was suddenly just a very large, very expensive real estate problem. The last emperor, Puyi, was a boy who liked to play with crickets and didn't fully grasp that he wasn't technically the son of heaven anymore. And the eunuchs, who had spent centuries controlling access to his ancestors, were now left polishing empty thrones because no one told them what else to do. And in the Ottoman world, it was the same sad, slow fade-out. The sultans sent into comfortable exile, while the eunuchs, who had once decided which concubine got to see the ruler, who had whispered state secrets in corridors, who had managed entire palace economies, were suddenly just middle-aged men with no families, no heirs, and a medical condition that made ordinary village life slightly complicated. So some drifted into religious work because temples and mosques were at least familiar. Others became living relics for tourists, men who had seen empires fall but couldn't quite explain to the outside world what it felt like to watch centuries of ritual evaporate in a few years of modern reforms. And a few, like the Chinese eunuch Sun Yaoting, wrote down their memories for curious journalists, describing imperial banquets and secret corridors while sitting in tiny Beijing apartments with peeling paint and leaky roofs, because life after empire was rarely glamorous. And the irony is thick here. For centuries, people had feared the power of the eunuchs, accused them of manipulating emperors, of controlling harems, of being kingmakers behind the scenes. And yet when the whole system collapsed, the world discovered they had nowhere else to go. No hidden treasure, no second act. They just faded out, quietly, like stagehands after the play ends. And maybe that's the most fitting end for them, because their lives had always been about serving someone else's story. The emperors, the dynasties, the empires. And when those stories ended, theirs did too, leaving behind only a few aging men shuffling through old palace grounds, half forgotten by the modern age, carrying memories of ceremonies and scandals no one fully believed anymore. So by the 1950s and 60s, when the last of them were dying off, reporters would treat them like time travelers, asking what it was like to serve an emperor, as if they'd stepped out of a black and white photograph. And the eunuchs, polite as always, would answer, because what else was there to do when history had already left them behind?
And so we drift into the mid-20th century, when the last scraps of the old imperial world were colliding awkwardly with modern life, and the surviving eunuchs were like ghosts, wandering through cities that had once revolved around them, but now treated them as historical oddities, because Beijing in the 1930s and 40s was a chaotic mix of warlords, revolutionaries, and foreign soldiers. And in the middle of it, you might see an elderly man with the distinctive high voice and carefully shuffling walk of a palace eunuch, selling calligraphy on the street to buy dinner. While in Istanbul, the former chief black eunuchs, the ones who had once controlled access to the Sultan himself, were reduced to living in crumbling Ottoman mansions converted into boarding houses, telling half-true stories to travelers, because what else do you do when you used to run the harem, and now the harem is a museum with school groups taking notes about daily life in the palace? And the reporters loved this stuff. They would show up in the 1950s with notebooks and cameras, asking the old man about palace intrigues and secret tunnels, about concubines and assassinations, about the emperors they had served. But the truth was usually disappointingly mundane, because real imperial courts ran on paperwork, not wild scandals. So the eunuchs would give them little scraps of gossip, just enough to keep the legend alive, while privately dealing with poverty, illness, and the strange reality of being living links to a world nobody really missed. And there's something almost cinematic about it, like the end of an era filmed in slow motion, the marble halls echoing, the gates locked, the last servants still sweeping courtyards long after the emperors had been evicted. Except nobody wrote them a proper ending. No epic farewell, just a slow dwindling until one day in 1996, when Sun Yat-ting, the last imperial eunuch of China, finally died at the age of 94, having lived through emperors, warlords, Japanese occupation, civil war, communism, and finally the kind of modernity that paves over old palaces to build apartment blocks. And in Turkey, the last eunuch slipped away too, leaving behind maybe a few photographs, a few aging interviews, and miles of romantic nonsense written by Western travelers who loved the idea of mysterious palace servants but never bothered to learn their real names. So by the 1970s, the era of the eunuchs was over everywhere, the institution gone, the men themselves buried in ordinary cemeteries, their lives reduced to footnotes in books about fallen dynasties. And yet, for centuries, they had been at the center of power, shaping marriages, guarding heirs, controlling who saw the emperor and when, only to end as relics, as curiosities, as men out of time, watching buses roar past the gates where once only princes rode.
And maybe what makes the whole thing feel even stranger is how fast the rest of the world forgot them. Because when you think about it, these were people who had shaped dynasties, literally decided which concubine got to see the emperor on Tuesday, who lived in palaces of silk screens and gold leaf doors. And yet a few decades later, they were renting tiny rooms in Beijing alleyways or living above shops in Istanbul, quietly dying off while history textbooks skip straight from fall of the Qing or end of the Ottoman Empire to whatever came next, as if the human leftovers of those fallen worlds didn't matter. And sometimes you wonder if the eunuchs themselves realized the absurdity of it all. Like, did Sun Yat-ting sit in his little apartment in the 1980s watching state television announce space launches and new factory quotas and think, I once carried messages for the Son of Heaven, and now I'm listening to weather reports? Because there's something so surreal about lives designed entirely around emperors, continuing long after the emperors themselves were gone. And you read these old interviews where journalists would ask about palace scandals and secret love affairs, and the eunuchs, now half-deaf and squinting through thick glasses, would politely explain the proper order of serving tea at court or how many steps one had to bow when delivering an imperial decree, because that was their world, protocol, ritual, hierarchy. Things the modern age had no patience for. And yet without them, the empire would have fallen into chaos much sooner. Though, ironically, all those rituals didn't save it in the end. So you get this picture of the last eunuchs as men out of time, trained for a palace life that no longer existed, speaking in the formal tones of a vanished court while buses rumbled outside. And there's a kind of melancholy humor in the idea that the mighty empires which castrated thousands of boys to keep their palaces running left behind, at the very end, only a handful of old men giving tea ceremonies for curious tourists or writing down memoirs nobody read, like actors still performing lines from a play closed years ago. And maybe that's the quiet tragedy here. The emperors got biographies, the wars got monuments, but the eunuchs, who saw everything, who lived behind every throne, ended as a fading echo, half remembered by history and fully forgotten by everyone else. Except for the odd researcher or documentarian who comes along decades later, trying to imagine what it felt like when the palaces went silent and the men who once controlled access to kings were left holding nothing at all but memories.
And so by the late 20th century, the whole era of eunuchs had shrunk down to a few individuals scattered across China and Turkey, living archives of a world that seemed increasingly fictional to the people around them. Because when Sun Yat-ting told reporters about carrying lanterns through the Forbidden City or reciting decrees in front of the Dragon Throne, it sounded less like memory and more like some half-remembered opera no one performed anymore. And yet, he insisted it had been real. The palaces had been real. The emperors had been real. Even the endless rules about where you could stand and how you could speak had been real. Though by the 1980s, the Forbidden City was a museum with ticket booths and audio guides, while its last living servant was eating dumplings in a tiny apartment nearby. And in Istanbul, Hacı Bekir Ağa, the last chief black eunuch of the Ottoman Empire, died in 1971 after decades of watching his old workplace, Topkapi Palace, turn into a tourist attraction where schoolchildren on field trips took notes about sultans, while the man who once guarded the harem gates lived quietly in the city like a retired clerk, which, in a way, he was, since the modern republic had no use for men trained to enforce palace etiquette for rulers who no longer existed. And what's remarkable is how ordinary their final years seem. No rebellions, no grand memoirs shaking up history, just quiet lives of pension checks, second-hand furniture, and maybe a neighbor or two who vaguely knew they had once served emperors, but who didn't really care because the 20th century was busy with its own chaos. World wars, revolutions, television sets, space travel, leaving no room for nostalgia about the days when palace servants decided the rhythm of royal life. And so the last eunuchs died off, one by one, funerals attended by a few relatives or sometimes no one at all, until finally there were none left anywhere. No one alive who had stood behind a silk screen waiting for the emperor's signal. No one who had memorized the 1,000 tiny rules of bowing and tea pouring and decree reading. No one who remembered the private quirks of rulers now reduced to portraits on museum walls. And when you think about it, that might be the quietest end any institution ever had, because the eunuchs had been central to empire for centuries, advisors, gatekeepers, sometimes villains, sometimes saviors. And yet, when their time ran out, history just moved on, the modern world sweeping them aside like stage props left in a corner after the play closes, until all that was left were old photographs, fading interviews, and the occasional tourist staring at a palace corridor, wondering who once walked there, not realizing the answer was men, whose names have mostly vanished with the dust.
And maybe this is the part where history begins to blur into myth, because once the last living eunuchs were gone, the stories about them started to grow taller, the way stories always do when there's no one left to correct the details. So instead of men with sore knees and modest pensions, you start hearing about secret conspiracies in the Forbidden City, or whispered scandals in the Ottoman harem, as if the eunuchs had been running shadow governments for centuries, when in reality half their job was probably paperwork and making sure the emperor didn't trip over ceremonial carpets. But people love a good mystery, and nothing sells better than the idea of a silent, watchful servant who knows everything but says nothing. So the memoirs and interviews left behind got quoted out of context, embroidered with imagination, until by the 21st century, the eunuchs had become almost fictional characters, like something out of a costume drama, rather than the very real human beings who had to figure out how to pay rent when the empire collapsed. And it's funny because if you read the actual accounts left by men like Sun Yat-ting, they're full of boring details about wages and uniforms and palace routines, things nobody ever puts in movies, and yet they're also strangely moving, because you can feel the weight of a man's life built entirely around serving an emperor who stopped existing before he did. A life shaped by rituals so elaborate that decades later he could still recite the order of imperial ceremonies from memory, even though the throne room was now full of tourists eating ice cream. And maybe that's why the myth grew, because people couldn't quite accept that such an exotic, brutal, fascinating institution ended not with assassinations or rebellions, but with old men quietly shuffling through city streets unnoticed while the world modernized around them. And so now when we look back at the eunuchs, we tend to imagine them as sinister courtiers or tragic figures, or both, depending on the mood, when the truth is they were simply men caught in a system that gave them power and then erased it overnight, leaving only stories that get stranger with each retelling until eventually nobody remembers which parts were true and which parts were invented. And maybe that's how history usually ends anyway, not with facts neatly preserved, but with half-legends drifting through books and documentaries. The reality long gone, the details fuzzy, until one day someone asks, whatever happened to the eunuchs after the empire fell? And the answer is both too simple and too sad. They lived quietly, they died quietly, and the world barely noticed.
And so we wander slowly into the present day, where the palaces once filled with emperors, concubines, and the soft-footed eunuchs who managed them now sit as tourist attractions with gift shops and guided tours, the throne rooms roped off, the banquet halls full of folding chairs for conferences, the walls cleaned of smoke and dust so thoroughly that you'd never guess how much life once passed through them. And somewhere between the neatly printed museum labels and the drone of tour guides explaining where the emperor used to sit, there lingers the faintest echo of those men who spent entire lifetimes moving through these corridors without ever really owning a piece of the world they served, because the emperors got statues and portraits and Netflix adaptations, while the eunuchs got maybe a passing mention on a plaque, if that. Even though they saw everything, they knew which prince secretly cried before coronations, which concubine actually hated the palace food, which emperor got bored halfway through state rituals but kept nodding anyway. And all of that intimate human detail vanished with them, because when the eunuchs died, there was no one left to tell those small stories, the ones too undignified for official court historians to bother recording. And now the modern visitor walks through those vast echoing rooms under electric lights while someone with a microphone points out where the emperor once ate breakfast, never mentioning the servant who probably spent 40 years arranging those breakfasts exactly the same way every day, learning the emperor's moods by how loudly he chewed. Because that's the kind of detail history doesn't keep. So instead, we imagine the eunuchs as part of the architecture itself, as silent and unknowable as the carved wooden screens they once slipped behind, when in reality they were people with tired feet and inside jokes and small ambitions that never made it into any archive. And it's strange to think that the same world which once depended on them completely could erase them so thoroughly that now most visitors barely know what a eunuch even was, let alone that entire empires once trusted them more than generals or ministers. But maybe that's how it always goes with the people who work backstage, the ones who keep the machinery running while history shines its spotlight on the emperors giving speeches at the front, until one day the curtain falls, the audience goes home, the theater closes, and the stagehands walk off into obscurity, carrying memories no one else wants, because the show is over, the dynasty is gone, and the world has already moved on to the next performance without them.
And maybe to understand just how thoroughly the eunuchs slipped out of history, it helps to compare them to all the other palace jobs that disappeared along with the empires. Because it wasn't just the eunuchs who woke up one morning to find the imperial world gone forever. It was also the astrologers who used to chart the emperor's dreams, the poets who wrote flattering verses no one reads anymore, the scribes who spent entire lifetimes copying imperial decrees by hand only to be replaced by typewriters, the ceremonial musicians who played the same 12 notes every morning for decades because that was the tradition, the food tasters who probably developed ulcers from worrying about poison that never came, the concubines who discovered they were now just unemployed women with very complicated resumes, the court painters whose entire careers revolved around making royal chins look less unfortunate than they really were, the jesters who had once been allowed to insult the king as long as they did it in rhyme, and all the other minor human cogs in the vast machine of empire that collapsed almost overnight when the emperors were sent packing, because modern republics and parliaments and communist parties had no use for people whose entire skill set involved knowing exactly how many times to bow before presenting a bowl of soup. And so you get this mass extinction of professions that had existed for centuries, even millennia, vanishing so completely that now they sound like something out of fantasy novels, when in reality, whole palaces full of people once lived and died by these roles. People whose names we'll never know because history mostly wrote down what kings did, not what the man who ironed the king's ceremonial socks did. And so the eunuchs, as the most peculiar and extreme example, ended up symbolizing the whole strange world of palace life that disappeared without fanfare, because after the revolution or the coup or the invading army showed up, nobody kept paying the astrologer to predict which Tuesdays were lucky, nobody asked the court poet for sonnets about tax reforms, nobody wanted the eunuch to guard the gates of a palace now full of filing cabinets, and so these people drifted off into ordinary obscurity or poverty or, in rare cases, memoir writing, while the new governments paved roads through old gardens and turned throne rooms into banquet halls for visiting diplomats, who had no idea that a century earlier the place had echoed with the sound of ceremonial gongs summoning men who no longer existed, because the modern age has no patience for that kind of ritual. And maybe that's why the silence of those vanished professions feels so absolute, like a door slammed shut on an entire way of life the moment the last emperor walked out.
And so as the 20th century rolled on, and the last living fragments of those imperial worlds kept disappearing one by one, it left behind this odd emptiness in the historical record, because entire civilizations had revolved around these rituals, these roles, these men who served emperors in ways so specific and so ceremonial that modern life doesn't even have equivalents for them. And when they were gone, there was suddenly no one left who remembered how the morning drums sounded in the Forbidden City at sunrise, or what the Ottoman sultans looked like pacing their gardens before dawn prayers, or how it felt in those echoing throne rooms when every bow, every step, every carefully measured pause meant something in a language of gestures now completely extinct. And that's the strange thing about history ending. Not just the big events like revolutions or wars, but the quiet cultural endings where whole ways of life vanish and nobody writes them down because everyone assumes they'll always be there until they're not, like the eunuchs themselves, whose lives were so bound up with palace walls that when those walls fell silent, they simply faded away, leaving behind only the faintest traces in archives and memoirs and a few grainy photographs of men in long gowns with tired eyes staring at cameras as if they already knew nobody in the future would really understand who they had been or why their lives had revolved around emperors who themselves ended up as museum exhibits. And maybe that's why there's a kind of melancholy to the whole thing. Because the world didn't just lose a set of professions or court titles, it lost an entire rhythm of life, a way of organizing power and ceremony and hierarchy that had lasted for centuries. And whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing almost doesn't matter, because the real point is how quickly it all slipped into silence, so that by the time the last eunuchs were dying in the 1970s and 80s, most people barely knew such roles had ever existed. And today, the average tourist wandering through Topkapi Palace or the Forbidden City sees thrones and silk robes and imagines emperors and concubines, but not the people who kept the whole machine running, the servants, the eunuchs, the musicians, the heralds, because we always forget the backstage when the actors leave, even though the play couldn't have happened without it. And so what we're left with now are ruins and souvenirs and a few romanticized legends, while the real human details, the daily lives, the quiet routines that made up centuries of imperial history vanished along with the men who carried them out, leaving the modern world with palaces full of echoes and nobody who remembers the words to the songs that once filled them. And so we reach the end of the line, not just for the eunuchs, but for the whole strange, glittering world they served, because by the time the last of them died in the late 20th century, the palaces had already been scrubbed clean, catalogued, and turned into heritage sites where tour groups shuffle through with cameras while guides point out the thrones and the paintings and the jewel-encrusted swords, but never the men who once stood silently in the corners making sure every ritual happened exactly on time. Because modern history likes its emperors and battles and revolutions, but rarely cares about the people who carried trays of tea for 60 years without once spilling a drop. And the eunuchs were the ultimate backstage crew, both essential and invisible, shaping the daily lives of rulers whose names ended up in textbooks while their own lives dissolved into footnotes, so that now when we think about them at all, it's usually through the haze of myth or cliché, imagining scheming courtiers and mysterious palace whispers, when in reality most of them probably spent more time arguing about kitchen budgets than plotting political intrigue. Because empires, like everything else, run on logistics as much as ambition. But the fall of those empires swept all of it away so fast that within a generation the entire ecosystem of servants and rituals and court etiquette that had lasted for centuries was gone, leaving behind only buildings and titles and fragments of memory. And when you read the interviews with the last surviving eunuchs, you can hear the bewilderment in their voices as they describe lives spent memorizing ceremonies for emperors who ended up as private citizens or exiles, like actors performing for an audience that walked out halfway through the play. And maybe that's why their stories feel so strangely modern despite belonging to such an ancient tradition, because who hasn't wondered what happens to people whose whole world disappears overnight, whose skills no longer matter, whose lives no longer fit the age they're living in? And the eunuchs just happen to be one of history's clearest examples of that. Men trained to serve rulers who vanished, left to wander through cities that barely remembered them until finally they too slipped away, closing the book on a role that had shaped empires for over 1,000 years. And when the last one died, there were no ceremonies, no imperial farewells, just an obituary here or there, noting that the final thread connecting the modern world to the old palace courts had quietly snapped, leaving behind only empty throne rooms, fading photographs, and a silence so complete that most people never even realized what had been lost.
And so here we are, at the very edge of the story, with the last palace gates long since shut, the marble courtyards swept clean of sandalwood incense and ceremonial drums, the royal pavilions turned into echoing museums where sunlight falls through cracked lattice windows onto velvet ropes and polished floors, and the footsteps you hear now are only tourists with audio guides, not imperial messengers rushing to deliver orders at dawn, not servants carrying trays of delicacies to some long-dead emperor, not eunuchs waiting in silent rows for the signal to bow, because all of that ended so thoroughly that you can stand in the middle of those same rooms today and hear nothing at all, the kind of silence that feels heavier than noise, as if the walls themselves are aware they once mattered in a way they never will again. And maybe that's why the story of the eunuchs feels so haunting, because it's not just about a group of men whose entire existence revolved around a system that collapsed. It's about how entire worlds vanish while leaving behind these architectural shells full of faint impressions, like fingerprints fading on glass, so that historians have to piece together scraps from diaries and payroll lists and memoirs just to imagine the daily rhythm of lives spent entirely within palace walls. Lives that look so alien to us now, men forbidden from families, from leaving, from existing anywhere except in the shadow of thrones, and yet they were as real as any of us, walking those same courtyards day after day until the end came, first slowly, then all at once. And when the emperors fell and the palaces emptied, the eunuchs lingered for a while, like ghosts who hadn't yet realized the play was over. Because where else were they supposed to go after giving their entire lives to rulers who no longer ruled? Until time itself caught up with them and the last of them slipped away quietly in hospitals and nursing homes, leaving behind no heirs, no descendants, only fading photographs and a few brittle interviews where they tried to explain a world already too distant for anyone to really picture. And so when you visit those palaces today with their gleaming exhibits and neatly printed plaques, you might feel impressed by the gold thrones or the silk robes, but if you pause long enough in the quieter corners, you can almost sense the absence of the people who once filled them, the way the air feels hollow where entire lives used to unfold. And maybe that's the real ending here. Not with the emperors or the empires, but with the silence that followed, a silence so deep that it swallowed the footsteps, the voices, and finally the very memory of the men who had kept the whole thing running for centuries until history decided it didn't need them anymore.
And so as the lights dim on this whole story, we can almost imagine the final eunuch, somewhere in the late 20th century, perhaps sitting in a small apartment far from the echoing throne rooms of his youth, watching television in a world that had no emperors, no concubines, no court musicians announcing the hour with gongs. A man who had been trained from childhood to stand silently behind silk screens while monarchs made decisions that shaped kingdoms, now listening to the hum of electric fans and the clatter of city traffic outside. The centuries of ritual and hierarchy behind him, shrinking into something people would one day read about in history books without quite believing it was real, because how could they, when modern life has no space for men whose entire identities were bound up in ceremonial roles that no longer exist? And yet for over 1,000 years they had been essential. The ones who guarded the harem doors, who delivered the emperor's commands, who knew the routines of palaces better than the rulers themselves. And it's strange to think that the last of them lived long enough to see airplanes and telephones and skyscrapers rising over the same cities where they once lit oil lamps in silent corridors before dawn. And maybe that's the most haunting thing of all. Not that their world ended, but that it ended so completely that within a single lifetime they went from serving the Son of Heaven to explaining to curious reporters what life was like back when emperors still mattered, speaking in soft voices about court rituals nobody practiced anymore, until finally there was no one left to tell the story firsthand, only records and fading memories and empty palaces where tourists now snap photos in rooms that once required bows and whispers. And so the eunuchs slipped out of history the way a candle flickers out at the end of the night, leaving the world a little darker, a little quieter, as if all those centuries of ceremony had never really happened at all, because time doesn't pause for endings, it just rolls on, carrying away emperors and servants and marble thrones alike, until one day the only thing left is the echo of footsteps in an empty hall, and the faint knowledge that people once lived entire lives in service to rulers who became as ghostly as the men who served them. And maybe that's the final image worth holding on to, the thought of a palace at dusk, its gates shut, its courtyard still, its servants gone, while somewhere outside the modern city roars to life, unaware that 1,000 years of rituals have just vanished into the night without anyone even noticing the last curtain fall.